The forest of Mirkwood was the home to many different creatures and beings, and some of these were evil and servants of Sauron, while others were unwholesome or warped in some way. Even with all of this corruption, there still existed a force of good within these woods, the Elves of Mirkwood, and under the leadership of their king, Thranduil, they managed to keep these evils at bay and thrive throughout the Third Age. Hey guys, it's Carl here, and in today's episode, we'll be exploring the history, magic, and character of Thranduil, their greatest king. So Thranduil was born sometime in the First Age, though the exact date is uncertain, and he lived in the Elven Kingdom of Doriath, together with his father, called Orofer. Now most of his early history is tied with that of his father, and since I've already discussed this in great detail in my video on Orofer, I'll only be going through it briefly to avoid repetition. However, if you'd like a detailed account of these events, I'd highly recommend that you check out my video on his father, which I'll be linking above. To summarize it, Thranduil's life in the First Age was very turbulent and far from peaceful, for his home of Doriath was attacked and pillaged by the dwarfs of Belegost, and the elves that survived had no choice but to flee and find a new home elsewhere. They would settle next to the river Sirion, though after only 3 years, they would face another onslaught, though this time it was at the hands of their fellow elves, led by the sons of Feanor, and the survivors, including Thranduil and his father, would seek refuge among the elves that followed Gil-galad upon the island of Balar. Now Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, was finally defeated in the War of Wrath, and his defeat marked the end of the First Age. The Free People were finally free from his malice and tyranny, though even with this newfound peace, not all of the elves were happy, for some of them, including Thranduil and his father, had grown tired of being ruled by the Noldor elves, and they craved to have a simple elven life. And so in the year 750 of the Second Age, Orofer led a group of these elves eastwards until they came across the forest of Greenwood the Great, and they chose to merge their people with the elves that lived there, and Orofer became their king. Under his rule, the elves of Greenwood grew wiser, and they chose to isolate themselves from the rest of the Free People, though they would still participate in the Battle of the Last Alliance, for not even Greenwood was safe from the threat of Sauron. Thranduil would follow his father into battle, and he would witness his father's death as he recklessly charged into the enemy lines, and nearly 2/3 of the army of Mirkwood would fall during this war. Yet the Free People would prevail, and after this bittersweet victory, Thranduil led his people home, and he was crowned as the new king of Greenwood the Great. Now the start of Thranduil's rule was marked by a long period of peace and prosperity, as his people slowly recovered from their losses, though the horrors that Thranduil had witnessed in Mordor would lie heavy on his heart, and he could not forget them. They frightened him, and he worried that even though Mordor was now broken and desolate, it would one day rise again and threaten the world, and the safety of his people would be at risk. Men also troubled him, though to a far lesser extent, for their influence and dominion was growing stronger, and the Dunedain were approaching his southern lands, while the men of the north were settling next to the borders of Greenwood. Worst of all were the Easterlings, for they had a burning hatred for the Free People, and they were traveling westwards to seek out lands to occupy and plunder. Despite all of these troubles, Thranduil's people still prospered, and he became the greatest king of the Elves of Greenwood, and under his rule, the forest had grown beautiful, though unfortunately, a new threat would soon arise in the very heart of Greenwood, for Sauron had entered these lands disguised as the Necromancer, and he chose to settle in the fortress of Dol Guldur in the year 1050 of the Third Age, and he called out to many evil creatures, and they followed him into the forest, and the darkness and corruption would slowly start to spread out of this fortress, twisting the very nature of the forest and it became known as Mirkwood. The spreading corruption troubled Thranduil, for his people lived in the western valleys of the mountains of Mirkwood, and they were close to Dol Guldur, and so in his wisdom he decided that his people must abandon their home, and he led them northwards, where they established a new kingdom in the northeastern part of the forest. Here they would delve a great fortress, with many halls spreading underground, and it would serve as Thranduil's palace, his treasury, and the dungeons for his enemies. There is no doubt that this fortress was inspired by King Thingol and the halls of Menegroth, since Thranduil used to live there in the First Age, though they were only a pale imitation, for Menegroth had been crafted with the help of the dwarfs, and the elves of Mirkwood were more primitive than the elves of Doriath. Now Thranduil would sometimes ride out of Mirkwood to conduct business in the lands to the east, and it seems that under his rule, the elves of Mirkwood were less isolated, for they had friendly relations with the woodsmen and a trading partnership with the men of Laketown. They would even import wine from far-off lands such as the great gardens of Dorwinion, and Thranduil would take part in the feasts of his people, and he had 2 different crowns, which he wore according to the seasons. One was made out of red leaves and berries, which he wore in autumn and winter, while the other was made out of woodland flowers, and he would use it in spring and summer. Thranduil would also occasionally join his people in their hunts, and though the elves were at peace for the most part, they would sometimes fight with the great spiders of Mirkwood. Now one of Thranduil's greatest flaws was his weakness for treasure, especially for silver and precious gems, and even though his treasure hoard was great, it was not yet as splendid as that of the elven kings of old, and Thranduil was eager to enrich it. In fact, it seems that sometime in their past, his people were at war with some dwarven clan, for Thranduil had employed them to shape his raw gold and silver, and he accused them of stealing some of his treasure, while the dwarves claimed that Thranduil had cheated them by refusing to pay for their service, and so they had only taken what was owed to them. We'll never know which party was telling the truth, though I imagine, just like in most cases in history, the truth would lie somewhere in between. I also believe that this negative experience influenced Thranduil's perception on dwarfs, and it might have played a part in his poor treatment of Thorin and his dwarven company, for after the dwarfs trespassed into Thranduil's land during one of the elven feasts, they were captured by Thranduil's forces, and Thranduil interrogated them, though no matter how much he persisted, the dwarfs refused to share any details on their quest, for they were scared that Thranduil would demand a share of their treasure to set them free. This dwarven stubbornness frustrated Thranduil, and he chose to imprison the dwarfs in his dungeons until they shared their quest with him, though they would manage to escape thanks to the quick thinking of Bilbo, and they made their way to Laketown. Now while the dwarfs stayed in Laketown, rumors of their quest would finally reach Thranduil, and he suspected that the dwarfs planned to steal their treasure back rather than slay the dragon Smaug, and so he sent out spies to watch over the lake and the land surrounding Erebor, and Thranduil proclaimed that if the dwarfs were somehow successful in their quest, he would not allow any treasure to pass through Mirkwood unless he had a say in the matter. It's clear that Thranduil had not forgotten the legendary stories of the wealth of King Tror, and when news of Smaug's death reached him, he saw this as an opportunity to claim part of this treasure, and he rallied an army of spearmen and archers, and they marched towards the Lonely Mountain. Now the people of Laketown had suffered tremendously at the hands of Smaug, and their town lay in smoldering ruins, and in their desperation, they sent out messengers to the army of Thranduil, begging for his help, and Thranduil could not ignore their suffering, and he turned aside and ordered his men to bring a large store of food and supplies, and they built shelter for the men of Laketown to protect them from the coming winter. Thranduil's generosity and empathy saved the people of Laketown from suffering greater casualties, and after their safety was ensured, the warriors of Laketown would join the army of King Thranduil, and together they marched towards Erebor. They expected to find it empty and the dwarfs slain, and so when they reached its gates, they were surprised to find that the dwarfs were still alive in Erebor, and they tried to negotiate with them, though the dwarfs refused to negotiate with the elven army, and it seemed like war was inevitable. In a last-ditch effort to prevent this outcome, Bilbo snuck out at night with the precious Arkenstone, and he offered it to Thranduil and Bard, so that they could use it as a bargaining tool with Thorin, and this act of generosity and selflessness impressed Thranduil, and he offered Bilbo a place among his forces, where he would be honored and welcomed, though Bilbo graciously declined this offer, for he could not turn his back on his dwarven companions. Now even though the Arkenstone was by far the most precious treasure to Thorin, the riches of Erebor had filled him with greed, and he was reluctant to trade some of his gold for it. He planned to instead reclaim the Arkenstone in battle, with the help of Dane Ninefoot and the dwarfs of the Iron Hills, and Thranduil was troubled by the thought of this battle over gold, and he hoped that this unnecessary bloodshed might be avoided, and that they might still find a way to reconcile their forces. It seemed like Thranduil's fears would come to pass, though as the battle was about to commence, Gandalf appeared, and he informed these forces that an army of goblins and wargs was approaching, and that the dwarfs, elves and men had no choice but to ally together and face this new threat. As the goblin army advanced, Thranduil and his people were the first to charge at them, for their hatred was old and bitter, and the free people would emerge victorious, though it came at a heavy cost. For many elves, dwarfs and men died in the Battle of the Five Armies, including Thorin, and despite their troubled past, Thranduil decided to place Thorin's sword, called Orcrist, upon his tomb, since the elves had taken it from him while he was imprisoned in Mirkwood. Before Thranduil and his forces returned to Mirkwood, Bard granted him the Necklace of Girion as a token of gratitude for all the help that he provided to the people of Laketown, and Bilbo gave him a necklace of silver and pearls for the food and drink that Bilbo stole while he was sneaking in Thranduil's palace, and for this Thranduil thanked him, and he named Bilbo Elfriend. Now in the same year of Smaug's defeat, the White Council banished the Necromancer out of Dol Guldur, and many evil creatures were driven out of this land, which allowed the forest of Mirkwood to grow wholesome once more, though this newfound peace would be short-lived, and around 10 years later, these evil things would return in greater numbers. After Aragorn and Gandalf captured and interrogated Gollum in the year 3018, they left him in the care of Thranduil and his people, though Gollum would escape during an orc attack, and Thranduil sent out his son, Legolas, as a messenger to the Council of Elrond to inform them of this loss. This event was seen by many as the beginning of the War of the Ring, and Mirkwood would not be spared from Sauron's malice. For while Sauron attacked the Kingdom of Gondor in the south, his armies in the north were starting to gather in Dol Guldur once more, and he ordered them to attack the lands of Lorien and Thranduil's people in Mirkwood. The forest of Mirkwood was rife with battle, and Sauron's armies set it aflame, though Thranduil and his people would manage to repel them, and the fortress of Dol Guldur was destroyed by the elves of Lorien. Following their victory, Celeborn and Thranduil met in the middle of Mirkwood, and they renamed this forest to Erin Las Galen, meaning the Wood of Green Leaves. They decided that the northern region, from the mountains of Mirkwood to the northern tip of the forest, would become Thranduil's realm, while the rest would be divided between the woodsmen and the elves of Lorien. After the passing of the Rings of Power, the elven realm of Lothlorien started to fade away, and very few of its people remained in its lands, while Thranduil's kingdom remained untroubled, and they were probably the greatest and one of the last elven colonies to remain in Middle-earth. However, it seems that they too were destined to fail eventually. For in the history of Middle-earth, it's implied that Thranduil's realm slowly started to shrink and fade as men took over their lands, and I imagine that Thranduil was the last king of his line, if not the last king of Mirkwood, considering that his son, Legolas, chose to travel to the Undying Lands rather than remain in Middle-earth. I also feel that it's important to mention that we don't know anything about Thranduil's wife or when his son Legolas was born, and it's also worth clarifying that the scars that were seen on his face in the movies were simply an invention and they did not occur in the books. Before ending this video, I'd like to quickly discuss some of the elven magic we see in the books, which was probably Thranduil's. So the borders of his land had a spell of weariness, that whoever crossed into it would grow tired and fall asleep, which is how the elves had managed to capture Thorin. I believe the Black River in Mirkwood had a similar elven spell, and if you'd like to learn more about it, I covered it in great detail in my video which I'll be linking above. We also see how elven magic lit up the realm of Thranduil with magic torches that could be turned off and on instantly, and Thranduil's magic could also be seen in the doors of his palace, which closed automatically and prevented his enemies from escaping. Anyway friends, this wraps up today's video and I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Thranduil. Do you prefer his portrayal in the movies or in the books? And is he one of your favorite elven kings? As always, I'd like to thank my patrons who have really helped to elevate this channel. It wouldn't be the same without you. And I would like to express how grateful I am for your support, especially our Wizard tier patrons, T. Gorman, Mike Feeney, Roland Mervold, and Jacob Williams. If you too would like to help support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, I'll be leaving a link to my Patreon page in the video description below. I'll also be leaving links to our Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and Twitter communities, so follow us if you'd like to have some extra Lord of the Rings content in your day-to-day lives. As always, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.